The little girl clutched her teddy bear as two security guards led her toward the front doors. Her small hands trembled, and her big, round eyes filled with confusion. She didn't understand why the man in the expensive suit was so angry. "Get her out of here," CEO Daniel Whitmore ordered, his voice sharp, impatient. "This is a place of business, not a daycare." The girl sniffled, looking up at him. "Please, sir. I just need to find my daddy." Daniel's jaw tightened. He had no patience for interruptions, especially not from some random child. His company, Whitmore Industries, ran like a well-oiled machine, efficient, disciplined, with no room for distractions. And yet, here was this little girl, disrupting his day like she belonged here. "I don't care who you're looking for," he snapped. "You have no business here. Take her outside." The security guards hesitated. They had worked under Daniel long enough to know he was a ruthless businessman, but even they felt uneasy about throwing a child out onto the street. One of them, a tall man with graying hair, bent down. "Sweetheart, do you know your mommy's phone number? Someone we can call?" The girl's lips quivered. "Mommy told me to come here. She said my daddy works here." A hush fell over the lobby. Several employees glanced at each other, whispers spreading like wildfire. Daniel felt his patience snap. "I don't have time for this. Get her out." The security guards nodded hesitantly and led the girl to the entrance. As they pushed open the heavy glass doors, the cold wind hit her tiny frame, making her shiver. She turned back one last time, her eyes pleading. "But Mommy said you would help me." Daniel didn't flinch. He had no time for dramatics. The doors swung shut behind her. Across the lobby, Mrs. Clark, the company's longest-serving receptionist, stood frozen. Her heart ached as she watched the girl sit down on the sidewalk, hugging her teddy bear. Rain had started to drizzle, soaking her thin dress. Mrs. Clark turned toward Daniel, her expression unreadable. Her wrinkled hands gripped the edge of her desk as a terrible realization dawned on her. She had seen that little girl before. Or at least, someone who looked exactly like her. A memory surfaced, an old photograph, buried deep in the past. And just like that, Mrs. Clark's breath caught in her throat. Because she knew the truth. The little girl Daniel had just thrown out was his daughter. The rain drizzled steadily, soaking the pavement outside Whitmore Industries. The little girl sat on the cold concrete, hugging her teddy bear tightly to her chest. She didn't cry, not anymore. She had already shed her tears inside, begging the scary man to help her. But he didn't listen. Inside the building, the tension was thick. Employees exchanged nervous glances, whispering among themselves. The incident had rattled many of them. How could Daniel Whitmore, the CEO, throw a helpless child out onto the streets? Mrs. Clark couldn't focus. Her hands trembled as she pulled open her desk drawer, searching for something she hadn't looked at in years. An old photograph. It was slightly faded, creased at the edges, but unmistakable. A younger Daniel, his arm wrapped around a woman with a bright smile, stood next to a baby girl in her arms. The same big brown eyes. The same dimple in her cheek. Mrs. Clark's heart pounded. Could it really be? She looked up at Daniel, who had returned to his office as if nothing had happened. His face was unreadable, his posture stiff as he buried himself in paperwork. But she saw it now, the shadow in his eyes, the tightness in his jaw. He knew. Maybe not fully. Maybe not yet. But something inside him had been shaken, and Mrs. Clark wasn't about to let this rest. Outside, in the rain. The little girl, soaked to the bone, sat motionless. Cars passed by, but no one stopped. Then, a kind voice broke through the silence. "Sweetheart, what are you doing out here alone? A middle-aged woman with a bright yellow raincoat crouched beside her. The girl looked up, shivering. "Mommy told me to find my daddy. But he said I don't belong here." The woman frowned, glancing up at the towering office building. She had heard the rumors. Everyone in town knew Daniel Whitmore. He was rich, powerful, untouchable. But could he really be this cruel? "What's your name, honey?" The little girl sniffled. "Lily." "Lily, do you know where your mommy is?" A deep sadness flickered across the child's face. "Mommy's gone." The woman's heart clenched. "Come with me, sweetheart. We'll figure this out." She held out her hand. Lily hesitated, glancing back at the glass doors of Whitmore Industries, still hoping, still waiting. But no one came. Slowly, she took the woman's hand. And just like that, she walked away from the place that had rejected her. Inside Whitmore Industries, Mrs. Clark moved quickly. She had known Daniel since he was fresh out of college, hungry to prove himself in the corporate world. Back then, he was different, warmer, kinder. He used to talk about love, about family. But that was before ambition took over. Before he sacrificed everything for power. She stormed into his office without knocking. "Daniel." He barely glanced up. "What is it, Mrs. Clark?" Her grip tightened around the photograph. "That little girl, do you know who she is?" Daniel exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "She's a nuisance, that's what she is. I don't have time for." Mrs. Clark slammed the photo down on his desk. He froze. Slowly, his eyes moved to the picture. A long silence stretched between them. Then, barely above a whisper, Mrs. Clark said, "Look at her, Daniel. Look at her face." He didn't want to. But something, some unseen force, made him do it. His fingers trembled as he picked up the photo. His younger self stared back at him, alongside a woman he had tried to forget. And the baby girl in her arms. Daniel's heartbeat pounded in his ears. "No," he whispered. "Yes," Mrs. Clark said firmly. "That little girl you just threw out? That's your daughter." His breath caught. A sharp, undeniable pain cut through him. He struggled to breathe, his mind racing. It couldn't be. But deep down, he knew it was true. His past had just come knocking. And he had slammed the door in its face. Daniel sat frozen, the old photograph trembling in his hand. His mind swirled with memories he had long buried, her face, her laughter, the promises he had once made and broken. His voice was barely a whisper. "No. It can't be." Mrs. Clark crossed her arms. "You know it is." Daniel clenched his jaw, forcing himself to push past the suffocating weight of the moment. He was a man of logic, of facts. And the facts, as far as he was concerned, were simple: his past was behind him, and nothing could change that. Still, doubt gnawed at him. That woman, he exhaled sharply. Lily's mother. What happened to her? Mrs. Clark's expression softened. "She passed away, Daniel." The words hit like a hammer to the chest. "How?" "Cancer." It was quick, aggressive. She didn't have much time. A lump formed in his throat. Mrs. Clark took a step closer, her voice softer now. "She must have told Lily to find you before she died. That little girl, she came here believing you'd help her. She trusted you." Daniel shot up from his chair, his pulse hammering in his ears. "And I threw her out." Mrs. Clark nodded. "Yes. You did." A deep silence filled the room. For the first time in years, Daniel felt something foreign, something uncomfortable: guilt. Meanwhile, outside, Lily sat curled up in the corner of a dimly lit diner, sipping a warm cup of cocoa. The kind woman in the yellow raincoat, whose name was Patricia, had taken her inside to dry off and get warm. "Feeling better, sweetheart?" Patricia asked gently. Lily nodded, but her little face remained troubled. "Why didn't he want me?" Patricia sighed, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, Lily. Big ones. But that doesn't mean they don't care deep down." Lily's fingers tightened around the cup. "Mommy said he would help me. She said he was my daddy." Patricia's heart ached. "I think maybe, he just didn't know." Lily's lower lip trembled. "He knows now." Patricia reached for her phone. "Do you have any other family, sweetheart? Maybe an aunt, an uncle?" Lily shook her head. "Mommy said Daddy was my only family now." Patricia hesitated, then made a decision. "I think we should give him another chance." Lily looked up, hopeful yet wary. "You think he'll come for me?" Patricia squeezed her hand. "If he has any heart left in him, he will." Back at Whitmore Industries, Daniel was already in his car. He didn't know where he was driving, only that he had to find her. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, his mind racing. Lily. His daughter. How had he not seen it? He had always been good at compartmentalizing, at locking away emotions that made him weak. But this was something different. This was real. His foot pressed harder on the accelerator. He had to find her. Then, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "This is Whitmore." A woman's voice, calm, steady. "Mr. Whitmore, my name is Patricia. I have Lily." His stomach dropped. "Where is she?" "We're at Mick's Diner on 5th Street. She's safe, but she's confused. Hurt. You need to come now." Daniel didn't waste another second. "I'm on my way." At the diner. Patricia watched through the window as a sleek black car screeched to a stop outside. The door flew open, and out stepped Daniel Whitmore. Tall. Cold. Powerful. But tonight, he looked different. He looked like a man on the verge of breaking. Lily saw him through the glass. Her tiny hands gripped the edge of the table, her breath hitching. He had come. Patricia bent down, whispering, "What do you want to do, sweetheart? It's your choice." Lily swallowed hard, then slowly slid off her chair. The diner door creaked open. And for the first time, Daniel and Lily stood face to face, no security, no walls between them. Just a man and the daughter he never knew he had. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say a word, Lily took a step back. Hurt still lingered in her big brown eyes. And without saying a word, she turned away. Daniel felt the weight of regret crash over him like a tidal wave. He was too late. Or was he? Daniel stood frozen at the entrance of Mick's Diner, watching as Lily turned her back on him. It was a feeling he wasn't used to, rejection. His entire life had been about control. Deals, negotiations, power moves, he always dictated the terms. But this? This was different. This was a 5-year-old girl telling him, without words, that he had failed her. And for the first time in years, he felt powerless. Lily climbed back onto the diner seat, hugging her teddy bear as if it were the only thing keeping her safe. Daniel exhaled sharply and took a slow step forward. "Lily," his voice was softer than he intended. "I." She didn't look up. Patricia crossed her arms, standing between them like a protective barrier. "Mr. Whitmore, she's not ready to talk to you yet." Daniel swallowed hard, nodding. "I understand." Patricia studied him. "Do you?" For once, Daniel had no sharp reply. No cold dismissal. He simply looked, lost. Patricia sighed and pulled out a small, tattered envelope from her purse. Her mother left this for you. Daniel frowned, taking the envelope hesitantly. His name was written on the front in familiar handwriting, one he hadn't seen in years. His throat tightened. She carried this with her, Patricia continued. Hoping she'd get to give it to you herself. Daniel's fingers trembled slightly as he turned the envelope over. He looked at Lily again, still curled up, still refusing to meet his gaze. He had no right to ask for anything from her. Not yet. But he could read the letter. With a quiet nod, he turned and walked outside. Outside the diner. The rain had stopped, but the cold air remained. Daniel leaned against his car, staring at the letter in his hands. He hesitated, then carefully unfolded the paper inside. And then he began to read. Dear Daniel. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And if you're reading this, it also means that I believed, despite everything, that you deserve the truth. Her name is Lily. She is your daughter. I never told you because, when I found out I was pregnant, you had already changed. You were no longer the man who once whispered about love under the city lights. You became someone consumed by power, someone who didn't believe in family. I was scared, Daniel. Scared you would reject her. Scared you would see her as a burden instead of a gift. But now, I have no choice but to believe in something bigger than my fears. Lily needs you. She is strong, but she is still just a little girl who has lost the only parent she's ever known. And you are the only family she has left. Please, Daniel. Don't make the same mistake twice. Don't walk away from her. Love. Emily. Daniel clenched his jaw, his grip on the letter tightening. The words hit like a hammer to his chest. He had spent years convincing himself that his past was irrelevant, that emotions were weaknesses, that attachments only got in the way of success. But now, a part of that past was sitting just a few feet away, inside a small diner, sipping cocoa with a woman who had shown her more kindness in one night than he had in a lifetime. A lifetime that should have included her. His daughter. His blood. His heart pounded as he closed his eyes. Emily had been right, he had changed. But what she didn't realize was that she had been the reason he had changed. Losing her had made him colder, more ruthless. He had convinced himself that love was just another liability. And now, the one piece of love he had left in this world was slipping through his fingers. Daniel inhaled sharply, pushing off the car. He wouldn't let it happen. Not again. With renewed determination, he folded the letter carefully, tucking it inside his coat pocket. Then, he turned on his heel and walked back into the diner. Inside the diner. Patricia watched as Daniel strode back in, his expression unreadable. Lily sat quietly, stirring her cocoa with a small spoon, still avoiding his gaze. Daniel exhaled and took the seat across from her. I read the letter, he said softly. No response. I know I hurt you today, he continued, his voice lower now. And I know I can't fix that overnight. Lily's fingers curled tighter around her teddy bear. Daniel hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out the letter and placed it gently on the table. This was from your mommy, he said. She wanted me to have it. And she wanted me to be here for you. Lily's breath hitched at the mention of her mother. Slowly, her big brown eyes lifted to meet his for the first time. Mommy gave that to you, she whispered. Daniel nodded. She did. Lily stared at the letter, her small chest rising and falling rapidly. A battle waged inside her, years of longing for a father she had never met, mixed with the raw wound of being turned away just hours earlier. Daniel saw it all. For the first time in a long, long time, he didn't feel like a CEO. He just felt like a man. A man who had just discovered the most important thing he'd ever lost. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slip away. The diner was silent. The weight of the moment hung between them, Daniel, a man who had spent his life building walls, and Lily, a child who had spent her life looking for the one person who should have been there all along. Lily's small hands clutched the letter as if it were the last piece of her mother she had left. Her big brown eyes, filled with uncertainty, flickered between the paper and the man across from her. Daniel knew he had to tread carefully. One wrong word, one wrong move, and he might lose her forever. "I want to fix this," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "I don't know how yet, but I want to try." Lily hesitated, her fingers tightening around her teddy bear. "Mommy said you were busy." Daniel's heart clenched. He had been. He had been too busy for love. Too busy for family. Too busy for the one thing that should have mattered most. "Not anymore," he said, shaking his head. "Not when it comes to you." Lily blinked, unsure whether to believe him. Before either of them could say more, Patricia, who had been silently watching, cleared her throat. "It's getting late, and Lily needs a place to sleep." Daniel straightened. "She'll stay with me." Lily's eyes widened in panic. "No." The word cut through him like a knife. She wasn't ready. Patricia placed a calming hand on Lily's shoulder. "Maybe it's best if she stays with me tonight. She's been through a lot, Daniel." Daniel swallowed his pride and nodded. "Of course." Lily clung to Patricia as they stood up to leave. But just before they reached the door, she turned back. "Are you gonna be here tomorrow?" she asked softly. Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat. "I'll be here. I promise." She studied his face for a long moment before nodding. Then, she disappeared into the night with Patricia. Daniel sat there for a long time after they left. He had promised. And this time, he wasn't going to break it. The next morning, a sudden disappearance. Daniel arrived at Patricia's house early the next morning, his heart unsteady. He was a man who closed billion-dollar deals without blinking, yet here he was, nervous about seeing a 5-year-old girl. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Nothing. A cold feeling crept up his spine. Something wasn't right. He pulled out his phone and dialed Patricia's number. It went straight to voicemail. His pulse pounded. He knocked again, harder this time. Finally, the door creaked open, revealing an exhausted and anxious-looking Patricia. Daniel frowned. "What's going on?" Patricia ran a shaky hand through her hair. "She's gone, Daniel." His world tilted. "What?" "I woke up this morning, and she wasn't in her bed. The front door was unlocked." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Lily was missing. A desperate search. Daniel wasted no time. Within minutes, he had his private security team scouring the city. Every street, every alley, every possible place a scared little girl might go. His heart pounded as he drove through the streets himself, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Where would she go? Then, it hit him. She had come to him yesterday, searching for her father. If she had run away, she was searching again. But for what? And then, like a flash of lightning, he knew. She wasn't running away. She was looking for her mother. At the cemetery. Daniel pulled up to the cemetery, his car skidding to a stop. He sprinted through the rows of headstones, his breath heavy, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then, he saw her. Lily sat curled up at the base of a gravestone, her tiny arms wrapped around herself, trembling from the cold. Her teddy bear lay beside her, soaked in morning dew. Daniel's chest ached at the sight. Slowly, he approached, crouching down beside her. "Lily." She flinched but didn't move away. He exhaled, his voice breaking. I was scared too, you know. Lily's small fingers traced the engraved letters of her mother's name on the stone. I miss her. Daniel swallowed hard. I do too. She looked up at him, searching his face. I wanted to ask her if it was okay to be with you. Daniel's throat tightened. He reached out slowly, hesitating before gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. I don't know if I deserve you, Lily, he admitted. But I want to be your dad. If you'll let me. Lily sniffled. You promise you won't leave? His heart clenched. I promise. A long pause. Then, to his surprise, Lily reached out and took his hand. Daniel felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, he wasn't chasing money. He wasn't chasing power. He was chasing something far more valuable. Family. And this time, he wasn't going to let it go. Daniel held Lily's tiny hand, his grip firm yet gentle. The weight of his promise settled over him like an anchor, heavy, unshakable. For years, he had lived for success, power, and prestige. But none of it had ever felt as important as this moment. Lily sniffled, her gaze still fixed on her mother's gravestone. I don't know what to do without her. Daniel's chest tightened. Neither do I, he admitted. But maybe, we figure it out together? Lily hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. It wasn't full trust, not yet, but it was something. He would take it. A gust of wind rustled through the cemetery, carrying with it the distant sound of approaching footsteps. Daniel turned, immediately on alert. Patricia was running toward them, her face pale with worry. Oh, thank God, she breathed, clutching her chest. Lily, sweetheart, you scared me half to death. Lily shrank back slightly, guilt flickering in her eyes. I'm sorry, Miss Patricia. I just needed to see Mommy. Patricia sighed, kneeling beside her. I understand, sweetheart. But you can't just run off like that. Daniel's jaw clenched. The thought of losing her again made his stomach twist. We need to make sure she's safe from now on. Patricia glanced at him. And what does that mean, Daniel? Daniel exhaled. He had spent years shutting out emotions, pretending that family didn't matter. But this little girl, his daughter, had shattered all of that in a matter of hours. I want her to come home with me. Lily's eyes widened. Your big house? Daniel nodded. Yes. My home. But only if you want to. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Lily's face. She hugged her teddy bear tighter. Patricia watched her carefully before turning back to Daniel. She's been through a lot. She needs stability. Daniel met her gaze. And I'm going to give it to her. Patricia studied him for a long moment, then sighed. Then you better be ready, Daniel. Because being a father isn't a business deal. You don't get to quit when it gets tough. I know. Patricia nodded. All right. But if Lily ever feels unsafe, she comes back to me. Understood? Daniel's answer was immediate. Understood. A new beginning. Lily sat quietly in the back seat of Daniel's sleek black car as they drove toward his mansion. Her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her dress, her teddy bear resting on her lap. Daniel glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Are you okay? She nodded but didn't say much. For a moment, he wondered if this was a mistake. He was a businessman, not a father. He had no idea how to raise a child. What if he messed this up? The car pulled up to his estate, a massive, modern home with sprawling gardens and a grand staircase leading up to the entrance. Lily's eyes widened slightly. You live here? Daniel forced a small smile. Yes. And now, so do you. Lily hesitated before unbuckling her seatbelt. As she stepped out, she clutched her teddy bear a little tighter. Daniel opened the door for her, guiding her inside. The grand chandelier, the marble floors, everything about the house screamed wealth. But for the first time, Daniel saw it through different eyes. It was cold. Empty. It had never felt like a home. Lily's tiny footsteps echoed as she took in the unfamiliar space. Then, her voice broke the silence. "Where's my room?" Daniel blinked. He hadn't thought about that. Patricia had been right, this wasn't a business deal. He couldn't just bring her here and expect her to fit into his life like another asset on a balance sheet. He had to make room for her. Literally. He cleared his throat. "You can pick any room you want." Lily's eyes lit up, just for a second. "Any room?" Daniel nodded. "Any room." A long pause. Then, she whispered, "Can I have a nightlight?" Something inside Daniel cracked. She wasn't asking for much. Just something to make her feel safe. For a child who had lost everything, even the smallest comfort mattered. Daniel knelt beside her. "You can have whatever you want, Lily." She studied his face for a long moment, then finally nodded. For the first time since she walked into his life, Daniel felt something shift. Maybe, just maybe, this could work. A father's trial begins. That night, Daniel sat in his office, staring at an untouched glass of whiskey. His mind raced. He had spent his entire life making money, building an empire. He knew how to control boardrooms, how to negotiate with billionaires. But none of that mattered now. Because somewhere down the hall, in one of the many rooms in his mansion, was a 5-year-old girl who needed him to be something he had never been before. A father. And for the first time in his life, Daniel Whitmore was terrified. Daniel stood outside Lily's bedroom door, hesitating. He had spent the entire evening trying to focus on work, reviewing contracts, analyzing reports, but for the first time in years, none of it held his attention. Because down the hall, in a room that had never been used before tonight, was his daughter. His daughter. The word still felt foreign, unreal. He took a deep breath and knocked gently. No answer. Slowly, he pushed the door open. Lily was curled up in bed, her tiny frame barely making a dent in the oversized mattress. The night light he had installed glowed softly beside her, casting warm patterns on the walls. She was awake. She wasn't crying. She wasn't speaking. She was just staring at nothing. Daniel stepped inside cautiously, unsure of what to say. He had negotiated multi-million-dollar deals with ruthless businessmen, but right now, facing this little girl, he felt completely unprepared. I wanted to check on you," he said awkwardly. Lily didn't respond. Daniel exhaled, glancing around the room. He had made sure it was perfect: soft blankets, stuffed animals, a brand new dresser filled with clothes Patricia had helped him pick out. Everything a little girl could need. But none of it mattered if she didn't feel safe. After a long silence, Lily spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you even like kids?" Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "What?" She shifted under the covers. "Mommy said not everyone is good at being a parent. Some people don't want kids at all." Daniel swallowed hard. He wasn't sure how to answer that. Did he like kids? He had never thought about it before. He had never needed to. But he liked her. And that scared him. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "I never thought about it before." Lily turned to face him, studying him carefully. "Then why did you come back for me?" Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. He could have given her a logical answer, because she was his responsibility, because he owed it to her mother, because it was the right thing to do. But none of that was the truth. Instead, he said the only thing that mattered. Because you're my daughter. Lily's fingers tightened around her teddy bear. You didn't want me before. Daniel felt that hit deep. She was right. He had turned her away without a second thought. But he wouldn't make that mistake again. I was wrong, he admitted. I didn't know who you were. I didn't know what I was losing. Lily stared at him, searching for something in his face. After a long moment, she whispered, "Are you gonna leave me too?" Daniel's heart clenched. He crouched down beside her bed, leveling his gaze with hers. "No," he said firmly. "I won't leave you." Lily hesitated. "Promise?" Daniel nodded. "Promise." Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out her tiny hand. Daniel didn't hesitate. He took it, wrapping his much larger fingers around hers. For the first time, Lily didn't pull away. And for the first time, Daniel felt like he had done something right. The first real test. The next morning, Daniel woke up to something unfamiliar, tiny footsteps echoing through the halls. Lily. He found her in the kitchen, standing on her tiptoes as she reached for the cereal box. His personal chef, an older woman named Margaret, was watching with an amused expression. "She's very independent," she whispered as Daniel approached. Lily barely glanced at him as she poured the cereal into her bowl. Daniel hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Good morning." Lily didn't respond right away. Then, after a long pause, she mumbled, "Morning." It wasn't much. But it was something. Margaret chuckled and handed Daniel a cup of coffee. "She's testing you, you know." Daniel frowned. "Testing me?" Margaret nodded. "She's waiting to see if you'll stay. If you mean what you say." Daniel exhaled. He couldn't blame her. She had lost her mother. She had been thrown out by the man who was supposed to protect her. Of course she didn't trust him yet. But he would earn it. One day at a time. A father's lesson. That evening, as Daniel sat in his study, he heard soft footsteps behind him. He turned, and to his surprise, Lily stood in the doorway, hugging her teddy bear. Daniel set his papers aside. "Hey, kiddo." Lily hesitated, then stepped forward. "Can you read me a story?" Daniel's chest tightened. "A story?" She nodded. "Mommy used to read to me." Daniel had never read a bedtime story in his life. But as he looked into his daughter's hopeful eyes, he knew there was only one answer. "Of course." Lily climbed onto the couch beside him, handing him a small book. As Daniel opened it and began reading, Lily leaned against his side, her tiny frame pressing into him. And for the first time in his life, Daniel Whitmore, the ruthless, heartless CEO, felt like something more. He felt like a father. For the first time in his life, Daniel Whitmore woke up with a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with money or power. It had been 2 weeks since Lily moved into his home, and in that short time, his entire world had shifted. The icy mansion that once felt sterile and empty was now filled with the soft echoes of little footsteps, quiet giggles, and the occasional clatter of toys on the floor. Daniel wasn't used to it. But he didn't hate it. He was learning, step by step, what it meant to be a father. And yet, there was still something hanging over him, a weight he had yet to lift. The world still saw him as Daniel Whitmore, the ruthless CEO. The man who had thrown a child out of his building without a second thought. The public didn't know the truth. Lily deserved better than a father who hid in the shadows. And today, Daniel was going to change that. The press conference. The reporters had been buzzing all morning. Daniel Whitmore never held press conferences unless it was to announce a major acquisition or a corporate victory. So when an invitation was sent out for an urgent public statement, speculation ran wild. Inside the grand conference hall, cameras flashed as journalists scrambled for the best seats. And then, he walked in. The Daniel Whitmore they knew had always been cold, untouchable. But today, something was different. His usually immaculate suit was slightly unbuttoned at the collar, his face less rigid. He stepped up to the podium, took a deep breath, and looked out over the sea of flashing lights. For the first time in his career, he wasn't here to protect his company. He was here to tell the truth. A father's public apology. I stand before you today, not as a CEO, Daniel began, his voice steady but firm. But as a father. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. The reporters leaned in. A few weeks ago, a young girl walked into my office. She was looking for someone. Someone important. He exhaled, his grip tightening on the podium. She was looking for her father. And I turned her away. Gasps rippled through the audience. The reporters had heard rumors. They had seen the security footage leak onto social media. But to hear him admit it? That was something else entirely. I was a fool, Daniel continued. A blind, selfish man who thought success was measured in wealth and power. He paused, his jaw tightening. But I was wrong. Because the most important thing I have ever been given in this life is not my company, not my fortune, but my daughter. A stunned silence filled the room. Many of these reporters had built careers covering Daniel's rise to power. They had written about his ruthless deals, his cold decision-making. None of them had ever seen him like this. I failed her, Daniel admitted, his voice raw. But I won't fail her again. His gaze swept over the audience, his next words slow and deliberate. I'm stepping away from Whitmore Industries. The room erupted. Shouts rang out. Reporters scrambled to ask questions. Daniel held up a hand. I built this company from the ground up. I made it what it is today. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what truly matters. His throat tightened as he thought of Lily's big brown eyes looking up at him, searching for love, for safety. I refuse to let my daughter grow up with a father who prioritizes money over her. He took a deep breath. I am choosing my family. And for the first time in my life, I know I'm making the right choice. The cameras flashed wildly. This wasn't just a press conference. It was history. After the storm. The fallout was immediate. Board members were furious. Investors panicked. The media exploded with headlines. But Daniel didn't care. Because when he walked through the front door of his home that night, Lily was there, waiting. She ran up to him, wrapping her tiny arms around his waist. You're home, she whispered. Daniel knelt down, holding her close. I always will be. She pulled back slightly, looking up at him. Did you really quit your job? Daniel smiled. Not exactly. But I made sure I'll have more time for you. Lily studied him, then gave a small nod. Good. Daniel chuckled. That's it? Just good? Lily grinned for the first time that day. And can we have pancakes for dinner? Daniel laughed, lifting her into his arms. You can have whatever you want, kiddo. For the first time in his life, Daniel Whitmore wasn't chasing after power. He wasn't chasing after wealth. He was chasing something far more important. And this time, he wasn't letting it go. The world outside was still reeling from Daniel Whitmore's shocking decision. News anchors debated whether he had lost his mind. Business analysts called it a foolish move. Investors scrambled to assess what it meant for the company. But inside his home, none of that mattered. Inside his home, a little girl was laughing. Daniel stood in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, flipping pancakes with a seriousness that made Lily giggle. You're doing it wrong, she teased, swinging her legs from her seat at the counter. Oh, really? He raised an eyebrow. And what exactly am I doing wrong, Miss Pancake Expert? Lily grinned. You have to make a funny shape. Mommy used to make a heart. Daniel hesitated, his chest tightening at the mention of Emily. I see, he said after a pause. Well, in that case. He carefully shaped the batter into a lopsided heart. Lily tilted her head, then burst into laughter. That's not a heart. That's a potato. Daniel smirked. Well, it's a very loving potato. Lily laughed harder, and for a moment, all the weight on Daniel's shoulders lifted. He wasn't in a boardroom. He wasn't making million-dollar decisions. He was just a father. And for the first time in his life, he understood what happiness really felt like. The weight of the past. Later that night, after Lily had fallen asleep, Daniel sat alone in his study. His phone was filled with missed calls from board members, lawyers, and media representatives. He ignored them all. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out Emily's letter, the same one that had shattered his world. He ran his fingers over the worn paper, reading the words again. Lily needs you. Daniel exhaled, leaning back in his chair. For so long, he had believed that success was measured in power, in influence. But what good was power if you had no one to share it with? His wealth, his empire, it had never filled the emptiness inside him. But Lily had. A tiny 5-year-old with a teddy bear had walked into his life and reminded him of something he had long forgotten. Love. Family. What truly mattered. And he wasn't going to waste another second chasing things that didn't. A new beginning. The next morning, Lily woke up to something unexpected. A brand new room. She blinked, rubbing her eyes as she sat up in bed. It was no longer just a guest room with new furniture, it was hers. The walls were painted a soft lavender, decorated with tiny glow-in-the-dark stars. Bookshelves filled with colorful stories lined one wall. A small play area sat in the corner. And on her bedside table, a framed picture of her mother. Lily gasped, her tiny fingers reaching out to touch it. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching her reaction carefully. I thought maybe you'd like to have a space that's yours. Lily turned to him, her eyes wide. You did this, for me? Daniel nodded. Lily looked at the room again, then at him. Slowly, she climbed out of bed and walked up to him. She hesitated, then wrapped her small arms around his waist. Daniel froze for a second, then gently knelt down, hugging her back. For the first time, she chose to trust him. And Daniel felt something inside him heal. Thank you, she whispered. Daniel swallowed hard. You never have to thank me for loving you, Lily. She pulled back slightly, looking up at him. Mommy would have liked you. A lump formed in his throat. I hope so. Lily smiled, then took his hand. Come on. Where are we going? She grinned. To make another funny-shaped pancake. Daniel chuckled, allowing her to pull him toward the kitchen. For years, he had believed he had everything. And yet, it was only now, standing here, holding his daughter's tiny hand, that he realized. He had been missing everything all along. But not anymore. Final narration, life lesson. Success isn't measured by the money we make, the power we hold, or the empire we build. It's measured in the love we give, the people we cherish, and the moments that truly matter. Daniel Whitmore spent a lifetime chasing wealth, only to realize that the greatest fortune he ever had, was the family he almost lost. Because at the end of the day, money fades. Power disappears. But love? Love is forever.